Many of the issues that I'll be talking about this morning derive from various work projects that were mentioned, and those studies and some of that literature are here on the table back here. All of those publications are available online. Some of the flyers list the URLs where you can find them, or you can just Google by the title, and you'll be able to find the references to much of the work that I'll be discussing. And one of the reasons why I find this panel so interesting is because of the different perspectives provided by each of the speakers. And I'd like to throw another angle onto the issues that we've been talking about this morning, placing these water management, water security issues in a global context, and taking off on a couple of the points that David mentioned at the beginning, that water is life and water is common to all. So what are the challenges and possibilities of responding to those issues and ensuring that we can provide water for all as the basis of our common life on this planet? So to begin, when we were talking about managing these water resources that are common to all and are the basis of life on this planet, we're really talking about managing multiple aspects, almost all aspects of human society. Water is the basis of agricultural production, our food supply. It supports vital ecosystems. It is used to maintain our public health and sanitation systems. We're also trying to prepare for and mitigate against weather disasters and extremes and fluctuations in our water supply, droughts and flooding, not to mention the spiritual value of water for many of our societies. And those issues are all tied together across those sectors in the minds of policymakers, decision makers, how to manage that water supply. There are trade-offs and priorities between different uses. Water that I am running through a hydropower facility, that I'm running through turbines, water that I'm running through a dam to generate hydroelectricity, for example, that's water that I am not storing for use at some other point in time for irrigation or municipal demand, for example. There are trade-offs. The issues are also connected through the hydrological system and through global systems. Climate change, to which we are all contributing individually and as countries and communities, through its impacts on our hydrometeorological systems, shifting the timing, the amount of rainfall and snowfall, for example, is impacting our global water supplies. Not only here in the United States, reference was made earlier to the example of the droughts in California, the American Southwest, and whether climate change is altering those patterns, but also globally, because as was also mentioned earlier, California sells food into global markets. So droughts, impacts, changes on agricultural production in California ripple through global supplies, and vice versa. Droughts in Canada, Argentina, global exporters of grains and cereals, for example, ripple through global markets and affect consumers elsewhere around the world. So we need to manage water holistically across these systems and across these users and across these locations around the world. Water security has been defined as the reliable availability of an acceptable quantity and quality of water for human health, livelihoods, ecosystems, and economic production, achieved at an acceptable level of water-related risks to people, environments, and economies. Easier said than done. As the basis of economic activity, we know that access to that reliable water supply is variable around the world, and the most developed economies, historically, are located in a sweet spot of regular rainfall, not too much volatility and variability, whereas countries and communities that lie more at the extremes, think of those arid locations that we heard about earlier, Yemen, for example, having that variability, that volatility, or that aridity, lack of access to regular water supplies, in turn affects the development of those societies through their agricultural production, people's access to safe drinking water, the maintenance of public health, right? And to offset that variability, human societies have historically had recourse to developing water infrastructure, those cisterns that David referred to earlier, large reservoirs, irrigation schemes, pumping water from one basin to another, from one location to another, as in California, to offset the impacts of variability in an effort to try and maintain a constant, regular water supply. But water is unequally distributed around the world. On a per capita basis, some countries and communities enjoy greater access to these resources than others, just through the natural variability in rainfall and snowfall, the availability of surface water and groundwater around the world. And the use of those water resources is also disparate around the world. Developed country economies devote more of their water resources to municipal drinking water, industrial processes, cooling of thermal power plants. Developing countries devote more of their water resources to agriculture, food production, and often have less availability of those infrastructure resources, irrigation schemes, reservoirs, and dams that would allow them to increase their agricultural yields. And this is one of the reasons why currently they devote more of their water resources to producing food than do developed countries like the United States, where our more efficient management of our water resources creates that surplus of water that we can then turn to other uses. And critically, for a more integrated, holistic management of this resource that's common to all, not only is water inequitably distributed around the world, but it crosses political boundaries. There have been a lot of implicit reference to decision makers, policymakers in our previous discussions, but not only does water resources cycle through a global system, constantly mobile, from rainfall to surface water to groundwater, flowing back to the oceans, evaporation, carrying water back into the atmosphere, but these cycles cross international borders and local borders at all scales. So they are shared between countries, between communities, between polities, and therefore between different centers of decision making. These are the world's international river basins. These are the world's aquifers. Look at all those splotches across those international borders. And these are the quantities, the importance of water that's shared between different nations, different decision makers. Actually 283 transboundary river and lake basins around the world, and a significant portion of the world's water resources crossing those borders, shared between peoples, between countries, common to all, but across political dividing lines. How are we doing so far in ensuring water security? Many of the world's major river basins today are what hydrologists call closed basins, meaning that under current management practices, all of the water available in these basins is already now allocated to various human resource uses and needs and to maintaining vital ecosystem services. There is no buffer or very little margin of maneuver left over to accommodate new users and new needs in these basins that you see in that dark red color. The US Southwest, all across the Middle East and North Africa, through northern China, the bread baskets for billions of people around the world. Those resources are already fully allocated. Global pollution levels are rising. This is nitrogen pollution in basins around the world, historically and projected out to mid-century. And the darker colors, numbers higher than 1 on the graphic that you see down in the bottom right, indicate that the absorption capacities of those rivers are already fully used. 1 equals a pollution level that the river's absorptive capacity can handle. Higher than 1, pollution overload for nitrogen pollution, which is largely a result of agricultural production, usage of fertilizers, et cetera. So meeting our food needs, trying to make water use more efficient, more productive, using, for instance, nitrogen-based fertilizers, then has consequences cycling back into the quality of those very water resources. Around the world today, many areas are already using more of their renewable water resources than are available on an annual basis. All of those red splotches are localities, countries, and communities that are using more of their renewable water on an annual basis than is available today. What are the impacts of these water stresses, these water scarcities? More than 600 million people, almost 700 million people around the world do not have access to improved water resources. More than 2 billion people around the world do not have access to improved sanitation services. Just to talk about the economic impacts of inadequate access to water resources, GDP growth around the world, if you're growing at 2% a year, 3% a year, that's really good. The world's fastest growing economy, India, grows at 6 or 7% a year. And yet the economic impacts of the environmental degradation of water resources, water scarcity, just to take some of the North African, Middle Eastern countries, can amount to 3% of GDP a year. In Pakistan, one of the countries that I work in often, 4% of GDP a year lost to the economic costs of water scarcity and environmental degradation. India, 6% of GDP a year lost. And the human toll is even more dire. The health consequences of inadequate sanitation, inadequate access to water in countries like Pakistan and India, 400,000 children younger than 5 years old die in India every year from diarrhea. 1/3 of all deaths and 2/5, 3/5 of hospital visits in Pakistan are due to water-related diseases. That's mind-boggling. And our demand for these water resources is growing. What's driving this increased need? Population growth. We're going to add 2 billion people by mid-century. Economic growth. Richer populations tend to use more water-intensive products and services. Their dietary possibilities change. Higher revenues, you can buy more meat, dairy, fruits and vegetables, more water-intensive food products. And it's really that question of feeding the world's population that has so far and will continue to sustain growth in our needs for reliable, clean water resources access. According to the World Health Organization and UNICEF, each of us in this room needs about, I think that the carafe there is probably about 1 liter of water. We need about 40 of those, about 40 to 50 liters of water a day to meet our daily drinking and washing needs. But the food that we're consuming, this is what's pushing the growth in demand for water. Those cups of coffee that are sitting in the back of the room takes 18,000, almost 19,000 liters of water to produce a kilogram of roasted coffee when you think of growing those coffee beans, producing those coffee beans, right? That's where the water pressures are. Just by 2030, 13 years from now, according to one study, there'll be a 40% gap in between the world's readily available renewable water supply and projected needs, without any miraculous technological solutions, just on current trends. Right? And those shortfalls, are distributed around the world unevenly. Major population centers, India, China, the shortfalls in basins across those countries can surpass 50% just in 15 years' time. And climate change is going to add to these stresses by affecting precipitation patterns, the timing, the amount of precipitation, the location around the world, the seasonality. One of the things that I like about these environmental maps is that often they're very easy to read because usually red is bad. And in these global maps, baseline scenarios, business as usual, without shifts in policy, you'll see increasing water stress by the end of the century across environmentally and politically sensitive areas, Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, in the blue global map, and then the increase in water stress is in the lower map. So those areas that are already suffering from water scarcity will see increased pressure on those sources under the impacts of climate change by the end of the century. And we know the human consequences, the societal consequences of those changes in access and those changes in availability. Just to take this example of Ethiopia, agricultural is highly dependent on rainfall, and just look at the way that rainfall and GDP track in that graph. Agriculture, I said before, uses in many developing countries 80 to 90% of their water. And agriculture is often a significant part of the economy and a significant employer, particularly in these nations. So to refer again to India and Pakistan, agriculture is about 20% of the national GDP of those two countries, but it's 40% of employment in Pakistan. It's almost 60% of employment in India. And under pressures from climate change, business as usual scenarios, the percentage change in yields just out to mid-century could fall up to 50% in these countries that you see as the red markers in this map. And the figures in below the regional headings, Sub-Saharan Africa 15%, South Asia 18%. That's the regional percentage of GDP that comes from agriculture. So you can imagine the repercussions on livelihoods if these pressures, if these impacts are borne out. Again, by mid-century, World Bank projects that without absent changes in our management practices and our policies, all the countries in blue on this map could see GDP fall by up to 6% in less than 40 years' time under the impacts of water scarcity and climate change. What might this mean for countries, communities, societies facing potentially increasing competition for access to water resources? Many analysts fear that this could lead to societal conflicts. In this map of Africa, the figures on the left-hand side are changes in precipitation and rainfall under climate change. And the figures on the right-hand side are possible increases in the propensity for civil violence, civil war even, or potentially international conflicts. What can we do about these challenges to mitigate these pressures? Water managers at all levels of society, local to international, we need more information about our current water use, our future water demands, and about management possibilities. We need better infrastructure, both hard infrastructure, canals, pipes, and soft infrastructure, professionals, societal capacities, and better institutions, decision-making structures for gathering stakeholders, actors, consumers, to make choices about how to meet these challenges and make potentially necessary trade-offs. Information shortfalls. This is a global map of centers around the world reporting water data to a central collection facility, a central UN collection facility in Germany. The availability of that information, river gauges measuring flows, groundwater gauges measuring changes in our aquifers, is much higher in Western Europe, the United States, the developed world, than it is in the developing world, even where the developing world represents the major locus of those water pressures and challenges that I showed you on the earlier maps, right? And even the water data that we have from many of these reporting centers is not adequate historically in terms of long-term time series in order to be able to adequately measure and understand changes and evolutions in that water picture. So to know, for example, whether shifting rainfall, shifting precipitation patterns today in California is an anomaly historically or not, to know whether it represents some type of trend, you need to know not only how much is it raining today, but how much was it raining yesterday and last year and 100 years ago. And we often don't have that information. Infrastructure, we're not investing what we need to be in terms of projected demand to meet those challenges. And water development is not a priority as it should be around the world, and particularly for many countries facing the most severe water stresses. You can compare the black bars in this graphic, military expenditure, to the light blue bar, expenditure on water supplies. And institutions. If we need to manage water across political boundaries, then we need to have agreements, architectures, treaties, arrangements to make decisions about those water supplies. But if you divide the planet up into all the national pieces of transboundary river basins, and you ask, does that river, the Nile, which supplies 11 countries, the Indus, which supplies 4, for example, if you ask, are all of the riparian countries, that's all of the countries along the river, are they members of some type of international arrangement? Does the treaty or the institution have mechanisms for making decisions about changes in water flow? Does it have a conflict resolution mechanism, for example? You see that worldwide, most of the world's international basins do not, in fact, have any transboundary arrangement at all. Those that do often lack these vital functions and procedures like conflict management. Or those that do don't include all of the relevant countries. So again, to take the example of the Indus, shared by 4 nations, Afghanistan, China, India, and Pakistan, there is an international treaty for managing the Indus, but it only includes India and Pakistan. So we have serious institutional shortcomings to manage as well. But we know these investments can pay off if we can make them. In this graphic, in this map, we can see both Western Europe and Africa. On the far left, you see the incident water stresses. That means the existing stresses, strains, pressures on water supply in terms of mismatches between supply and demand, but also pollution, environmental extremes, et cetera. And remember I said before, red is bad, so the deeper the kind of reddy orange color, the higher the incident stress, the incident pressures. And you'll see, look, they're particularly bad in Western Europe, which reflects pollution, industrial development, pressures that would be and are occurring on those water resources. The next graph in the left middle are the investments that these countries are making in managing those water pressures. Darker color, higher investments. Then next to the right, you can see how those investments are reducing the impacts of those water threats. Yes? Something water security. It's a human water security, I think. So that you can see, again, higher investments in Western Europe than in Africa, and at the end of the day, the impact, the upshot, the result of making those investments, look at the difference between the map on the left, the threat, the pressures, and the map on the far right showing how those investments reduce, manage, mitigate the pressures. So even though Europe starts out with higher threats to water security, it ends with a lower ultimate level of threat to its water resources because of the investments that it makes in water management. But this will not be easy. One of the reasons it won't be easy is because of those political borders, boundaries, divides that I mentioned at the outset. We need to manage water in a more integrated fashion. The term of art water managers use for these international, these transboundary river basins and aquifers is integrated water resources management. Looking at the basin as a whole, as an ecological unit, bringing all of the stakeholders and actors into the decision making. Water is common to all. Making responsible, informed, transparent decisions about the choices and trade-offs for managing our water. Great. Integrated water resources management. Raise your hand if you are for fragmented ad hoc water management. Got one taker. We'll talk.
It's nuanced. I just wanted to be different.
But as a society, as a polity, as a world, how are we going to make those decisions to integrate our decisions?
Yeah, I'm confident for integrate. I mean, the way you put it, they integrate management sounds good. However, many times when you have this centralized management, you have oppression of actually local community and indigenous communities needs. And sometimes the fragmented model may actually help safeguard and defend those and make them more vocal and more loud in the center of management. So, in a sense, I'm a little bit split whether we need which one would be using that.
Sure. No, and if you let me just go on for a second, we'll come to that because that is an excellent and fundamental point. That integrated water resources management in the minds of most practitioners does not necessarily mean centralized management, but it's a challenge for how do we open up the aperture wide enough to incorporate the different users and stakeholders at this basin-wide level and yet respond to and represent local specificities, right? And close down the system ultimately to make decisions, right? Because if your decision-making rule is unanimity and consensus across all of those local users, you'll get stasis. Or you'll get log rolling down to the lowest common denominator. If every user, look at California, right? If every user is a veto point, how do we get from the existing system that Polly highlighted to transformative change if our starting point is, oh, but wait, localities, different users, and who is in and who is out of the decision-making process. The map on the left here, that's the Indus Basin, right, in South Asia. That red outline, those are the international borders. The green is the hydrological basin itself, right? Crossing international boundaries, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China. Great, one level of political fracture and division. The map on the upper right, those are the groundwater aquifers, just in India, that users are also drawing on to meet their water needs, often in what's called conjunctive fashion, which means they can go back and forth in between water and surface water. Some users have access only to surface, some users only have access to groundwater, and in the Indus Basin, groundwater and surface water overlap significantly. That's all right, so farmers may be drawing out of the Indus surface water, irrigating their fields, maybe using flood irrigation and not the drip irrigation technologies that David talked about. But then that flood water irrigation seeps into the groundwater and replenishes and refills those aquifers. So, for an example of some of the complications of, okay, local communities, how do we take them into consideration, right? Suppose you've got a local community that is using floodwater irrigation and water managers are saying, oh, highly wasteful. right? You're losing a lot of your irrigation water to leaky canals and evaporation, right? You pour all this water all over the field, and most of it just evaporates into the air. We're going to fix that. We're going to use drip irrigation technologies so we can deliver water right to the roots of the plants and use water much more effectively and efficiently. Wonderful. Except two things will happen. One, farmers will say, oh, now I've got a lot more water. I can irrigate more fields, maybe even marginal areas, right? And two, now you've prevented a lot of that seepage from the surface water into the groundwater. So over here, we're managing water more efficiently for surface water uses, but over there, farmers who used to be pumping groundwater, now those sources are not replenished because you've prevented the seepage from the surface water source into the groundwater source, right? But back to the question of integrated decision making, who's in and who's out. Hydrological basin on the left, groundwater aquifers on the upper right, and then down here on the lower right, that's India's electrical grid, okay? Hydropower generated from facilities in the Indus Basin is exported outside of the Indus Basin, right? That orangish saffron, let's say, area of northern India. And then there's agriculture. In the Indus Basin, Punjab, which you probably can't read it, but up in the kind of center of the saffron-covered area of India, Punjab state is the breadbasket of India. Quarter of the wheat in the country, 10% of the rice in the country grown in the Punjab. Even more importantly, for India's national food buffer stocks to mitigate when there are shortfalls in production because of failed monsoon, for example, 50 to 75% of the wheat in that buffer stock for the whole country of India grown in the Punjab. 30 to 50% of the rice in the national buffer stock grown in the Punjab, okay? Which means that there are stakeholders, there are in effect water users through the food supply, through the electrical supply, all across India, who are not located in the Indus Basin. So when you are making decisions about the Indus Basin and saying we need to take account of different communities, we need to take account of different stakeholders, when India, as a national polity, is making decisions about its water management, the Afghans, also part of the Indus, are they in or out of that decision making? Right? The people who live outside of the Indus Basin but use the electricity, are they in or out? People who are eating the food grown in that basin, are they in or out? And on what basis? On what basis would you have electricity users outside of the Indus Basin telling water managers inside the Indus Basin, this is how you've got to run your turbine, because I'm a stakeholder? Maybe we can square that circle. I'm not saying that we can't. I'm just saying we have to figure out how. And it won't be easy. And principally, one of the reasons why it won't be easy, my final point, is because water is common to all, but our decision-making procedures are not. We need to make the choices, make the trade-offs, make the agreements, have the dialogues in order to make those decisions. Because we won't be able to get water to its highest use, as Polly was saying, if we don't. Final example. You may have been reading in the news recently, if you've been paying attention in the past few years, Syria, Iraq, anybody heard of those countries? Syria and Iraq, Turkey as well, are in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, all right? And if you were managing the Tigris-Euphrates holistically in integrated fashion, if you were the Ottoman Empire and not the nation states that we have today, and you were saying we're going to devote water to its highest use, you would not be building dams and reservoirs or even growing much food in Iraq and Syria, because those are dry, arid countries, right? Agricultural production in those countries isn't as high as in other countries of the world could have better, more regular access to water resources, right? So you would import food into Syria and Iraq. And in fact, the Middle East is the world's largest importer of foodstuffs. Countries like Egypt, Jordan, they import 50% or more of the calories that they consume. So they are making water savings in a certain regard, because they're not using as much water resources to grow food as if they were trying to be autonomous, but they're relying on international markets to meet their basic food needs, right? Similarly with hydroelectricity and water storage, right? You would not build dams downstream in Iraq and Syria to create reservoirs, because those are dry, arid countries. A lot of that stored water is going to evaporate. So if you were managing the basin holistically, if you were the Ottoman Empire, you would say, let's build the dams upstream in Turkey, right? Better conditions for water storage and better conditions for generating hydropower. Because how is hydropower generated? Basically, you let water drop and it turns a turbine. You can let water drop in a more mountainous area where when you build that dam, it holds back a reservoir and lets water fall, than you can in a flat landscape where you have to build a huge reservoir that floods tremendous territory in order to get enough of a water buildup behind the reservoir, right, to create that drop. So in that flat landscape, it's hard to build hydropower facilities and you lose a lot of water to evaporation. So you would say, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to store water, build hydropower facilities upstream in Turkey. That's where we're going to build the irrigation and agricultural schemes. That's where we're going to generate hydropower. We, Turks, will sell you, Syrians and Iraqis, food and electricity, and in return, you, Iraqis, will buy your oil. Water's going to its highest use. Everybody's happy. Do you think so? Do you think Iraq and Syria want to depend on Turkey for their food security? It's a difficult proposition, right? Politically. What if there are frictions, as there are, between those countries? Will you cut off our food supply? If we depend on international markets for our food supply, economize on water, globally, we'll devote water to higher uses elsewhere, and we'll just import our food, right? But then what happens, as in 2007, 2008, and again 2010, when there are global food price shocks, and you see bread riots around the world, and policymakers, decision makers, responding to those pressures back through subsidies, devoting resources to politically powerful communities, right, in order to try and offset those political pressures. All right. So integrated water resources management, yes, but how are we going to do it? Folks online, answers? Okay.